Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackie Leiser, and I'm a manager with CAQH Core. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, where we'll be providing an update on the NCVHS operating rule recommendations. You'll be hearing from both Bob Bowman and Aaron Weber from the Core team today. If we take a look at the next slide, I'll just get things started with going over some logistics. So if you'd like to access today's webinar materials, you can go ahead and download the presentation slides from that handout section of your GoToWebinar menu. We'll also send out an email to all attendees and registrants in the next 1 to 2 business days, and that will include some information on how to access both the slides and the recording from today's presentation. If you have a question, please feel free to submit it at any time throughout the webinar using that questions panel on your GoToWebinar menu. We'll have some time at the end of today's presentation to answer some of your questions. Before I go over our agenda, I do just want to let everyone know that we are having a CAQH conference in September. So it's the 27th through the 29th, and we hope you join us for CAQH Connect 2023. It will be in Washington, D.C., and we have this QR code up here in case you have your phone handy and wanted to take a picture of it to link to the registration page. If you also download the slides from today, you'll be able to click that link to go ahead and register. So we hope to see you all there. All right, I'll run through our agenda quickly, and then I'm going to pass things off to Aaron to get us started with a CAQH Core overview. After the overview, we will go over the NCVHS process and their recent recommendations. Then Bob will go over the recommended rules themselves and what they entail and the benefits they'll provide to industry. We'll talk briefly about next steps, and then we'll close things out with audience questions. All right, so with that, I'm going to pass things over to Aaron.
Thanks, Jackie, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are right now. I am Aaron Weber, and I am the Vice President at Core. I'm going to walk you through a little bit of background on Core and the work that we do and our role we play as the designated operating rule authoring entity, and then turn it over to Bob to talk all about the technical details of the rules that have been proposed for federal mandate. So if you move to slide 6, Core is a nonprofit organization. We are an initiative of CAQH with a mission to improve interoperability through the creation and adoption of healthcare operating rules. Operating rules build on standards. They can't conflict, they can't duplicate what's in a standard, but they can build and enhance the standards, in particular around how and when information is sent and what data must be included in those standards. We see ourselves as an industry-wide facilitator and really bring together the entire industry to share perspectives and develop the rule requirements. In addition to our rule development process, which is all consensus-based, includes multiple levels of voting and approval, we do a lot of education and outreach, such as our webinar series, our conferences. We have a certification program where organizations can demonstrate their conformance with the operating rules by becoming Core certified. And we're increasingly trying to do more and more measurement to understand and be able to share the ROI and the impact of standards and operating rules. On the next slide, a little bit of a history lesson here about how the concept of operating rules came about. Our organization is modeled after the financial services industry, where if you think about the ATM network, you can go anywhere in the world and get money out of an ATM machine because the financial services industry has voluntarily agreed on sets of operating rules to exchange that data between financial organizations that allow you to withdraw money from any bank at virtually any time. And that concept really resonated in the healthcare industry back in around 2000, shortly after HIPAA was passed, which had requirements for industry to implement electronic standards to support the payment and billing processes in healthcare. What happened was, as these electronic standards were being implemented, there was still a lot of inconsistency in how they were being exchanged and the information contained in them. So provider working with multiple health plans was really challenged to automate their systems. So the industry came together and created CORE to develop operating rules to build on those administrative standards in healthcare. What started as a voluntary initiative and demonstrated ROI through reductions in denials and improved interoperability became recognized by the federal government through the Affordable Care Act, which added the concept of operating rules to HIPAA. So for all of the HIPAA mandated administrative simplification standards, there are also requirements for operating rules. In 2012, CORE was designated by the Secretary of HHS as the National Operating Rule Authoring Entity for all of those HIPAA mandated administrative transactions. So some of our operating rules are federally mandated and some are voluntary and available for organizations who want to implement them because they have a good business case to do so. We consist of more than 100 participating organizations, which are all listed on the next slide, really representing all of the stakeholders who are impacted by the HIPAA administrative transactions. So government agencies, health plans, vendors and clearinghouses, providers, standards development organizations, and others come to the table and join our subgroups and work groups to develop operating rule requirements that really enhance the ROI of the standards. And these organizations are very familiar probably to you. Hopefully your organization is a participant. If not, we invite you to join us as we develop operating rule requirements beyond those that we have today. Slide 9 outlines the 8 sets of operating rules that we have, the core participants have developed to date. Those in, let's say, purple or purplish blue color are the ones that are federally mandated under HIPAA. So every HIPAA covered entity is required to conform to these operating rule requirements. And then the other gray rules here are voluntary, and many organizations have gone through the core certification process to demonstrate their conformance with those rules as well. We are in the process this year of developing new operating rules with a focus on healthcare claims, value-based payments, and we just an hour ago launched a task group to update some of our EFT and ERA enrollment data rules. So we're constantly evolving the operating rules to ensure that they're meeting current and emerging business needs and value industry input and guidance as we go through that process. So moving on to the next section, in our role as the National Operating Rule Authoring Entity, we have a responsibility, and in particular our board of directors, which is composed of equal parts health plan organizations, provider organizations, and then vendors are represented as well. And we are guided by advisors from the standards development organizations and WEDI. Our board is responsible for identifying when they think an operating rule or a set of operating rules is ready for recommendation for federal mandate. And so on a couple slides ago, we saw that there are 3 sets of operating rules that are federally mandated. We have updated some of those rules over time to address emerging business needs, and we have come up with new operating rules over time. And so it's the board's responsibility to say, we think it would be beneficial for these rules to be implemented across the entire healthcare system, and there is a process for them to put forward a recommendation for HHS to adopt those operating rules under HIPAA. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to walk through that process for you and introduce you to some of the key players in the space. The first entity that plays a role in an operating rule becoming federally mandated is that called the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics, or NCVHS. NCVHS is a federal advisory committee to the Secretary of Health and Human Services on topics related to HIPAA administrative simplification requirements, population health, privacy and security, and a number of other issues that HHS is responsible for. That committee is composed of experts and academics from across the industry, and they are appointed, by industry, by HHS, by Congress, depending on how they come to be in NCVHS. And that group is responsible for sending recommendations to the Secretary of HHS on all of these various topics. So when our board decides that a operating rule, a new or updated operating rule is ready for federal mandate consideration, they send a letter, a formal letter to NCVHS describing the operating rule and the value that it will bring to the industry. So back in May of 2022, the core board sent a letter to NCVHS proposing a set of new and updated operating rules for federal adoption. Once NCVHS receives a letter from core, and there's a similar process for the HIPAA standards as well, they will collect industry feedback. So they put out a request for comment last fall where they asked industry-wide to provide feedback on the recommended new and updated operating rules. They asked specific questions on the impact the rules would have on organizations and industry around ROI. And then they held an industry hearing on January 19th of this year to further hear more feedback and have discussion around the proposed rules. So there were representatives from health plans, provider organizations, associations, standards development organizations that provided feedback at the hearing and through comment letters on the proposed operating rules. Once NCVHS feels like they have sufficient information around the proposed operating rules, they then make a recommendation to HHS in the form of a formal letter. So on June 30th, just a little over a month ago, 6 weeks ago, NCVHS sent a letter to the Secretary of HHS recommending a set of proposed operating rules for adoption under HIPAA. And we'll get into that specific recommendation on the next couple slides. Once HHS receives a recommendation from NCVHS on operating rules, they are then required to go through an expedited interim final rulemaking process. And this is required under the Affordable Care Act. So then HHS technically has 90 days to issue an interim final rule to the industry with a 60-day public comment period. So there's still more opportunity for the public to comment. So if you think through, public can participate in the rule development process. They can participate in the NCVHS request for comments, as well as the interim final rule comment period. So there's really 3 places where your organization can provide feedback. Once the HHS has reviewed all of the comments, if there's no major objections, then HHS will adopt the rule as final and the operating rules become mandated. Industry is then given 25 months to implement and adopt the new rules. And this has occurred already with the rules that are currently federally mandated. And if you move to the next slide, you'll see the set of rules that the core board recommended to NCVHS last year. So those include updated infrastructure rules for eligibility and benefits, claim status, and payment and remittance transactions. And Bob's going to go over all of the details of these requirements. It also included an updated connectivity rule. The current versions of the core connectivity rules that are federally mandated are over 10 years old, and we all know that the industry has evolved quite a bit since then. Updated eligibility and benefits data content rule, which has a ton of really great content in it that Bob will cover as well. A new operating rule, which requires information about patient attribution to be included in that eligibility and benefits transaction. as well as new operating rules for attachments for both prior authorization and healthcare claims. So again, all of the benefits and content of these operating rules was presented and shared with NCVHS, who then evaluated all of that feedback, and on the next slide, made their recommendation to HHS in their June 30th letter. So in their June 30th letter, NCVHS, and I'm going to almost read it verbatim so that it's very clear, but the letter is on their website. You can go link to it and read it as well. NCVHS recommended that HHS conduct rulemaking to adopt the updated infrastructure operating rules for eligibility and benefits, claim status, and electronic remittance advice transactions, and to conduct rulemaking to adopt the updated eligibility and benefits data content operating rule. NCVHS also recommended that HHS conduct rulemaking to adopt the new patient attribution content in that eligibility and benefits operating rule, as well as to conduct rulemaking to incorporate the updates to the core connectivity rule as it applies to the adopted X12 HIPAA standards in the adopted operating rules. And here they noted the need for consistency with the National Institute of Standards and Technology cybersecurity guidance, and there's even a footnote in the connectivity operating rule to ensure alignment from that perspective. Their fourth recommendation was not to adopt the core operating rules for attachments for claims and prior authorization. And NCVHS, for those of you who follow this world very closely, you will know that between May 22nd or May 2022 and today, CMS put out a proposed attachment standard rule, as well as some rules around prior authorization that we didn't know about at the time that these operating rules were submitted for federal mandate. NCVHS felt like since those standards had not been finalized yet, that these operating rules should really only be considered after publication of a final rule adopting a healthcare attachments transaction standard under HIPAA. So until there's a HIPAA standard for attachments, we're pausing on adoption of attachment operating rules. And then the fifth recommendation that NCVHS said was to exclude the core certification requirement language included in the proposed operating rules. So because we have a certification program, the core operating rules reference core certification and what the requirements are to become core certified. But core certification is not a requirement under HIPAA. It never has been. So excluding the certification language is consistent with how HHS and NCVHS have addressed this in the past regulatory practice. So in summary, the updates to the infrastructure rules, connectivity rule, and the eligibility data content rule, plus the new single patient attribution data content rule, have all been recommended to HHS for federal mandate. And if you want more detail or more background on the regulatory process around the HIPAA administrative simplification provisions, I highly recommend that you go to our website. Last month, the leadership from the National Standards Group at CMS, which is the group responsible for writing regulations related to those HIPAA requirements, gave a presentation on the rulemaking process, the timelines, et cetera, and it was a great overview. So if you want more detail on this process, please go and listen to that webinar. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who's going to walk through what is in these operating rules, what's going to be the benefit to industry if they are federally mandated, and as they become adopted, what will be the impact. So Bob, all yours.
Great, thanks, Erin. And as Erin mentioned, we are going to go into a little bit of detail on each one of the three sections, connectivity, the infrastructure requirements, and then some of the details around the eligibility rule updates as well. So we'll start off with the connectivity rule. And this new version C4.0.0, really extends many of the requirements that were foundational to, and that you'll find in, the HIPAA mandated connectivity rule, where we establish a safe harbor by using the public internet. We use very specific API technology protocols like SOAP and MIME. And we allowed specific requirements related to how the transactions should be conducted. Should these certain ones be in real time, like eligibility and claim status, or should this one, like the claims remittance advice transaction, be conducted in batch? So we have those types of requirements in the HIPAA mandated connectivity rule. We've made many updates to those requirements because of the way that the industry has progressed its technology base from over a decade ago to today. So we're continuing that concept of safe harbor. So entities are required to support SOAP messaging standards. So using that specific API technology that's really ubiquitous with most internet interactions that you see today when it comes to commerce. They use SOAP, right? Is really widely recognized to use this particular technology across the internet. We also have specific requirements for security using TLS 1.2 or higher, as well as authentication of X.509 and OAuth 2.0, very specific requirements that your technical folks can help you with and navigate. But many of these are, again, foundational to how contemporary internet protocols and internet data exchange takes place today. We've added the support of attachment transactions, as Aaron mentioned, within the details and the guts of this particular rule, so that if you do wish to implement the X12275 or the HL7 CCDA or a FIRE transaction, this new version of the core connectivity rule supports those. You'll find references to those types of interactions. You'll be able to put the guardrails within your systems and applications to conduct those types of transactions as well. New to the rule is the addition for the support for REST standards. So again, this allows for a more contemporary internet-based interaction of data exchange using Java format, using REST web services using a Java format, as well as supporting more contemporary API technology and integration, as we see through perhaps the development of FIRE resources and FIRE exchange when it comes to both administrative as well as clinical data exchange. So again, bleeding those kinds of technologies more and more together within our EHR systems, our practice management systems, as well as the support from vendors and clearinghouses who sit and mix within those data exchanges, all really to help support the exchange of data from a provider to a health plan, or from a health plan to a provider. What's really key and a component of our connectivity, and you'll see this on the next slide, is the result of really the definition and defining a safe harbor. This allows for any of the stakeholders within data exchange to really understand the roles and responsibilities that they have in exchanging that data. And it allows really that floor to be a really level floor. Everyone can come and dance on this floor and work with data exchange at this very specific level. With the safe harbor, it does require all health plans and clearinghouses, and these are HIPAA covered entities, to support all the connectivity methods defined within the rule. So that would be for both SOAP as well as for REST. Providers and software vendors or application developers only have to support at least one connectivity method. This allows for the provider to partner with a practice management system or software provider, and they can connect with their clearinghouses or with a health plan directly to make those types of interchanges and exchanges of the data applicable. So you can see where the providers on one side, the health plans on the other, and ensuring that either SOAP or MON could be used in the past or in the future using SOAP and REST to exchange that data. So it really allows for a more contemporary exchange of data, allows the providers to use a vendor of their choice, and allows the vendors and clearinghouses to interchange and exchange data with any of the health plans that they wish to exchange data with. Again, allowing for the very specific SOAP metadata within those transactions. It aligns with the core rules, allows for those clearinghouses or those software vendors or application developers that sit in the middle of that data exchange to very quickly and easily update their systems and softwares and applications and the next version of their software really easily, because the metadata is defined for each of the transactions. So if you're going to conduct eligibility or claim status or prior authorization transaction, for example, those all could be set within that SOAP interchange or the REST interchange really quickly. So allows for quick implementations. So all really helpful. On the next slide, you'll see that there are very many key benefits to implementing the more contemporary connectivity requirements in this rule. As you can imagine, it does align with CMS and ONC interoperability rules by including REST and the support for more contemporary API technologies. Again, really founding that safe harbor, establishing that floor that all stakeholders within this milieu can support and work on and remediate old systems and update to new systems becomes really quick and easy to do because everything is spelled out for you. All of the requirements, all of the ways that you need to support each of the transactions and interactions that need to take place, it's all defined. Again, the single source of everything's in one place for the rule, so it makes it really easy for your system application developers to use this resource and to use the guides within the resource and how to not only build up the guardrails for system authentication security requirements, but also the specificity needed to build up very direct connections between this particular eligibility API connects with this plan's API front door, and you can exchange the 270, 271 transaction. So again, updating that national floor really helps build a system, a network across the entire industry. I'd like to move on now to our infrastructure rules on the next slide. And again, as Aaron mentioned, there are very specific requirements that we consider infrastructure. On the next slide, you'll see that those infrastructure operating rules, again, define the roles and responsibilities between trading partners. They allow for the system or network to be built, and everyone kind of understands what's in the mix as they come to exchange this very particular type of data. So, for example, we have requirements that includes processing modes. Is this transaction require real-time or batch or both? There are response times. Is this a real-time transaction that must be conducted in less than 20 seconds? Or is it a batch and you have a few hours to process that entire batch of transactions before an acknowledgement is sent back? We also have requirements around system availability, connectivity, as we just mentioned, acknowledgements, and companion guides. And this is by transaction. So there's specific requirements for each transaction, and some of these change from one to the next, and some have specific requirements that others don't. So be sure to check the particular rule requirements for each rule, for each transaction, to understand that you're ensuring that your system remediation and the way that you're going to plan out the ways that your systems will be remediated is specific to each one of those transactions. It's really important. Just to give you some examples in particular for these updates, we can go to the next slide and you'll see that we have made revisions to the infrastructure rules, both for eligibility, claim status, and remittance advice. And these usually fall into these four buckets: the weekly system availability, the quarterly system availability, connectivity, and companion guides. For example, on the weekly system availability, we went from 86% uptime per week to 90% per calendar uptime per week. This allows for providers to have the data when they need it the most. So the systems, health plans, and clearinghouses, those systems are really up and available for the provider to inquire on a member's eligibility, for example. We've also included, for the first time, a quarterly system availability. Lots of feedback that we've heard from the participating organizations at CORE is that oftentimes with the complexity of cloud computing and the reliance on multiple systems and applications for an eligibility verification or for claim status inquiry, there's a lot more systems, a lot more overhead that takes place, computing overhead that takes place. So we've allowed those larger systems to have a little bit more of a downtime on a quarterly basis to make those system upgrades, complete the testing, and move that new code into production. So it allows for a little more contemporary understanding of the complexity of the systems and applications that support these transactions. We've gone through the connectivity, but the updates in the infrastructure rules now point to the new version, C.4, for our connectivity versus the earlier versions. And lastly, the companion guide has also been updated to include not only X12 transactions that might be part of your data exchange model, but also for non-X12 transactions. So if you're going to, for example, exchange the 275 transaction as well as the CCDA transaction, you can include those types of references in your companion guide to ensure that any sort of system developer, application clearinghouse, provider, for example, has the right information when they need it in the right location. So it makes it much easier for them to access that data without having to reach out and work with you directly. Again, the companion guides just help support development of the connectivity and ensure that the data exchange is exactly what everyone expects, those roles and responsibilities that are so important in EDI. As you can imagine, there are a number of benefits with the updates to the infrastructure rule, and you see those included on our next slide. Again, aligns with more contemporary technology that's in use today. Again, oftentimes, healthcare is a 24/7 business, so ensuring that providers have access to the data when they need it ensures that they can have a better functioning not only administrative system and improving the revenue cycle, but also to ensure that the interface that they have with the patient, that patient experience can be improved and allows them to really see the benefits of real-time contemporary computing. Providers will have access to the data, again, when they need it the most to serve the patient at the time of service. So, right, it really allows them to run an eligibility check, receive the number of remaining visits on their particular service. Perhaps it's related to physical therapy, and they can say, yes, you have 3 more visits. Let's schedule those 3 more visits out now, since we know that's how many more you have remaining in your benefit package. So it allows that immediacy of care and the patient experience to be much improved. Again, lastly, aligning all of the benefits or requirements around the latest version of the core connectivity. Again, it really makes it really simple for your folks who are going to work on building the systems and applications to make it more of a plug and play. Know exactly what the connectivity requirements are. Here's the infrastructure requirements to support that connectivity for each specific transaction. So real time for eligibility is required, batch is not. Claim status inquiry, real time is required, batch is not, for example, right? It allows you to spell out exactly what you need to do. And again, a really key component here too is that for vendors that work in only a specific space, so maybe you're just a claim and remittance billing vendor, you only need to worry about the requirements for remittance advice. So breaking out the infrastructure rules by transaction allows you to pinpoint exactly what you need to do. Our third and last section that we'd like to go into a little more detail on is the eligibility and benefit operating rules. As you can see on the next slide, from looking at a kind of historical picture of how eligibility has been implemented over the last decade or so, you see that when the rules were first published about 10 years ago and the requirements were required to be implemented in 2013, there was a steady increase of nearly of 20%, right, from 65% to 85% support. So the industry quickly adopted the core operating rules. Providers adopted the transaction and found immediacy in that data. They were able to use it and use it well, and they did. Over the last few years, we've kind of become a little more stagnant. It hasn't increased in the same pace as it did on its initial rollout of requiring the eligibility transaction. And so we took a step back and worked with our core participating organizations and really try to figure out, okay, what is causing this lag? Why is this not seeing the same kind of uptick as it had in the past? And part of it is the data has become more complex. We, as an industry, have made insurance products much more complex. Our benefit packages are more complex. We have tiered benefits that members and providers have to deal with, or actually it's a benefit, right? It's a tiered benefit. There are also different kinds of contracts that we have with members, with patients. There's different types of contracts now that we have with providers. Value-based payment didn't exist much in 2013. So those types of contracts and how they've penetrated the market has put some weight on the provider. They're now having to pick up the phone. They have to understand these more complex benefits. And the best way to actually do this is to make this all computable. So if we look at the next slide, you'll see that some of the benefits, some of the updates that we've made to the eligibility help support many of these more contemporary benefit structures, more contemporary contracting structures that are really important for us to understand. You can see that we have existing requirements to support real-time response, 52 service type codes, patient financial responsibilities, historic eligibility inquiries, what were my benefits in January versus what they are today. Very specific error codes have to be returned in those types of scenarios where errors occur. With the update, you'll see that we've included requirements to report their tiered benefit coverage. We've added a number of explicit STC codes. So if you're that specialist provider and you need to drill down on a member's benefits for your specialty, and those can now be learned instead of at a generic level, at a kind of a dump code level, you can really drill down into surgery, imaging, what are the benefits for these types of really specific coverage types. We do now require in the latest update maximum and remaining benefits, as well as the returning for prior authorization. Does this STC code or diagnosis code require prior authorization? We've also updated for telehealth to ensure that the telehealth benefits, if there are specifics related to those, perhaps the copay is different, perhaps the remaining deductible is different for telehealth visits, those can be returned now and showing that variance. A key one here that is really important and really progresses the industry forward is to return benefits at the procedure code level for PT, OT, surgery, and imaging. This is really important for you to understand that health plans will be able to support procedure code inquiry at these 4 types of benefits. So no longer a generic STC code for surgery or imaging, but the actual procedure code can be submitted in the inquiry and benefits can be returned at that level. So this is going to be significant impact when it comes to reporting these types of benefits back to a provider on that member, and the member will receive really specific care and the provider can receive really specific information related to these procedures. And as Aaron mentioned too, we also have, because of value-based payment is so important for the industry as we progress forward with these types of contracts, to return the single patient attribution data content rule requires that patient attribution status and the effective dates of the attribution to be included in the response. So now providers will have access to that information in the 271 response when they're actually servicing and seeing the patient with that eligibility inquiry. So again, really important. You can see on the next slide, as you can imagine, there's a number of benefits to the industry with implementing this latest update to the eligibility rules. Significant cost and time savings with providers not having to use a provider portal or a phone to understand the more complex benefits that a member has. And as the index mentions, you can save nearly $12 per eligibility transaction by making this computable versus getting them off of the phone. Again, we'll continue to coordinate between core and the standard development organizations as we understand as they progress with the latest versions of the standards, and many of these rule requirements will become embedded within the standard. Again, we're just trying to make sure that you are aware that we work and coordinate very closely with both X12 and HL7 as they develop specific data content standards. Last but not least, again, it's really important to understand that telemedicine, prior authorization, and data at the really much granular level of a procedure code is really important for providers, and they have worked diligently with us, along with the health plans as our participating organizations have, to really understand what we need from them to ensure that we get the best benefits from the rules and the implementation of these new operating rules with the transactions themselves. So thank you. I'll hand the call back over to Aaron to close us out on next steps. Aaron?
Great, thanks, Bob. No significant next steps coming out of this. On the next slide, just a reminder of what we talked about from the NCVHS and HHS process. The next step would be to expect an interim final rule in the coming months related to those operating rules that were recommended by NCVHS. From a core perspective, our next steps are to help you all understand and implement these operating rules. So we will be launching a dedicated website to help keep you informed, as well as support any comment development for an IFR, as well as to start thinking about how to implement these operating rules within your own organizations and potentially becoming core certified on them. So we encourage you to reach out if you have any questions at all. And now I think I'll turn it over to Jackie for questions.
Thanks, Erin. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in that questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I haven't seen any come through during the webinar, but we did have some come through during registration, so I can go ahead and start with those. The first question is, as a provider, what can I be doing now to prepare for implementation of these recommended operating rules?
I think that's a great question, Jackie, and really all stakeholders should be thinking about this. You know, under HIPAA, you are required to be compliant with the operating rules. So you can do an assessment to see what operating rule requirements apply to your stakeholder type. Many organizations rely on vendors or business associates to help meet some of these requirements. So it will be important to be reaching out to your vendors to make sure that they are planning to be in compliance with these requirements as well. Core certification is a great way to confirm that your vendor is in compliance with the operating rule requirements, and participate in the regulatory process, provide comments, and share with HHS the value you think these rules will bring to industry.
And this is Bob. Maybe I'll just add a key component there that Erin mentioned is core certification. And certification is a great way to understand if the health plan or if your vendor or the software clearinghouse, whatever vendor that the provider might use in their transactions, whether it's their EHR, you might have a different one for your remittance advice versus your eligibility transactions versus your claim status transactions. We do keep a running list of each entity and what their certification status is for each of the transactions. So it's a great resource, it's free, and it's on our website. If you're looking to make sure that your vendor is keeping a pace with the ever-changing nature of the technology as well as the operating rules, you'll see them on that list if they've completed their certification.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks, Bob. I think we have time for one more question. What can industry do to help move core attachments operating rules forward for federal adoption consideration?
That's another good question. I think one of the things would be continue to speak out on the importance of having standards and operating rules for attachments. We know right now, based on the CAQH index report, that a lot of attachments are still exchanged manually, and that is a costly and inefficient process. And so, you know, using the regulatory process, the comment periods to share your perspectives on how that impacts your organization, as well as piloting the operating rules and standards. You know, there's no reason you can't go ahead and implement the operating rule requirements, and measuring the benefit that brings to your organizations and your trading partners will help inform HHS and NCVHS as they look to make recommendations on these standards and operating rules at an industry level.
Great, thanks, Erin. All right, so with that, we only have about a minute left, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. But if you do have any questions for our team, please feel free to email us. You can email us at core@caqh.org. Similarly, if you're interested in becoming a CAQH core participant and want to be involved in the development of these operating rules, you can send us an email there as well. We're always happy to take any questions about participation you might have. And this is just a reminder, like I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we'd love if you join us for the CAQH Connect conference next month. So please feel free to visit our website to register. We hope to see you there. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon, and thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good afternoon.